As Israel marked the one-year anniversary of the October 7th attacks, students at Columbia University in New York staged demonstrations, some in support of Israel, others backing the Palestinian cause and protesting the war in Gaza. Columbia was the site of mass protests against the war earlier this year and touched off a wave of campus demonstrations around the United States. DW's Aya Ibrahim reports from New York.
Police, barricades, lines, and ID scanners. These are unusual measures for Columbia's campus, otherwise known for its openness to the public. But in the lead up to October 7th, university leadership deemed them necessary for student safety. Inside, protests and counter-protests. On one side of the divide, a pro-Israel demonstration.
Today is not about us here. It's really not. It's about our friends and family in Israel. It's about commemorating October 7th. We just wanted to find a way to honor the hostages, to remember the people that were killed, and to raise awareness.
Separated by metal and public safety officers, others protest the war in Gaza those attacks triggered. They want their university to cut ties with companies linked to Israel.
They are getting such explicit funding and support right now. We have a right to mourn, we have a right to be here, and we have a right to care about the people in Palestine.
These protests are some of the biggest on campus since the new academic year began last month. In the spring, dozens of students were arrested here amid protests calling for an end to the war in Gaza and for Columbia to divest from Israel. Protesters seized a building, and a student encampment was violently dismantled by New York City police. Today, an installation in memory of hostages killed and still held in Gaza stands in its place. The university's interim president visited the installation Monday morning. The experience of the spring has left a mark on the student body. Many pro-Palestinian demonstrators tell us they're afraid to show their faces, fearing retribution.
Everyone whose face has been exposed has been photographed. Many of us have ended up on doxing websites. My name is on several websites with incorrect information about me. And that is a huge risk for all of us. It also means that for me personally, I don't know if I'll ever be able to visit my loved ones in Palestine again because I have my name in that space and I'm doxed in that way.
As the university hopes to avoid a repeat of the spring, students on both sides of the divide tell us a lot more needs to be done for there to be trust between them and their peers, and for them to feel safe on campus.
The increased surveillance keeps us in such a dangerous position, and it's very hostile.
The people on the other side don't talk to me, but I just try to tell them that we are human and Jews should be allowed to grieve in peace.
A year on, the sides struggle to even find the basis for a conversation.
U.S. President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden led a ceremony at the White House in remembrance of the more than 1,200 people, including dozens of Americans that were killed. We asked our chief international editor, Richard Walker, in Washington, how supportive the Biden administration is of Israel's actions.
The Biden administration certainly remains fundamentally supportive of the Israelis and of Benjamin Netanyahu's government. And you see that in the statement that Joe Biden put out today, which really spoke of the horrors of October the 7th last year and stressed that Hamas is responsible by unleashing that attack last year for what has happened since then. And Biden repeatedly uses this expression that the commitment of the United States to Israel's security is ironclad. But at the same time, and you alluded to that, I think, in the introduction there, Brent, that there is division within the United States about this. There's increasing criticism of Israel's conduct of the war in Gaza and now towards Lebanon. And you've had this sense that throughout this period that Biden has been trying to rein in the Netanyahu government, to try to restrain it, to try to get it to pay more attention to avoiding civilian casualties in Gaza, and now trying to limit escalation in this impending possible conflict with Iran. So the Biden administration constantly trying to kind of juggle these two priorities. On the one hand, support for Israel, but on the other hand, just hoping that this conflict doesn't get even worse.
Let's cross over to our correspondent, Aya Ibrahim, who's at Columbia University in New York. Aya, what have protesters there been telling you?
Well, you certainly can't see it right now, David, but this was a much fuller campus this morning. But maybe you can hear some of the workers behind me dismantling some of the barricades that the university had put up to make sure that the two groups of protesters were at a safe distance from each other. I had a chance to speak to both the pro-Palestinian students here on campus and also those who were commemorating the October 7th attack on Israel. On the Palestinian side, I will say there was a lot of fear among the students, also fear from the media. It was actually quite a challenge to get somebody to speak to us on the record and give us their name, because there is that impression that their narrative and their story is twisted in mainstream media. They also had a lot of fear from doxing, from being identified, and then being either disciplined later by the university or that this could affect their career chances because they're associated with the Palestinian cause. Of course, as you mentioned, last year Columbia was the epicenter of U.S. campus protests, and there had been arrests. Students had been arrested, and some were suspended and put on probation. On the pro-Israel side, I mean, there's of course a lot of mourning, a lot of devastation at what this day brought to many of their loved ones and their families in Israel. But there's also, of course, a lot of disappointment and certain hostility towards their pro-Palestinian classmates. For what they perceive. One student told me, for example, that he claims that his fellow students support, quote, terrorism, and so there's quite a divide between students here on this day. At least on other days on campus you can't really see it, but today it was very pronounced. One student that I met just in the lawn behind me, who was protesting, commemorating the October 7th attack, said, we live in different worlds.
Really divided there, and those weren't the only protests in the U.S. Let's zoom out a little bit, though. Could protests like these have an impact on the U.S. elections, which are just less than a month away?
Well, these campus protests are spread out across the country. Students, on a specific campus don't typically come from that particular state, or they're not all from that particular state or that particular city. However, the debate around anti-Semitism and anti-Palestinian rhetoric on college campuses has certainly sort of taken a life of its own in American political rhetoric, and we've seen former candidate Joe Biden and also the Republican nominee Donald Trump both sort of address this issue and try to spin the story in a way that would be appealing to their bases. So certainly, I don't think it's going to really, given the size of the protests that we've seen today, necessarily turn into what we've seen last year. But certainly what we've seen last year did have did take a massive space in American political discourse with, the candidates weighing in on the issue themselves. So it remains to be seen if that's something that we're going to see return with these protests.
DW's Aya Ibrahim there in New York. Thanks, Aya.